Good morning, Bucketeers. Welcome to the Bucket Courses. I'm Joanne Bunley. I chair the Community Education Council, the CEC, which is happy to bring you the Bucket Courses. If you will remember to silence your cell phone and turn on your tea coil, we'll be ready this morning. We have a first-timer teaching at the Bucket Courses today, so be on your best behavior. She has been recommended to us, and I know that you're going to enjoy her. Jean Ketter is Professor of Education at Grinnell College, and she is going to talk to us about disabilities and being human. Please welcome Jean Ketter. Good morning. Good morning. Oops. Good. Ooh, too loud. Good. Nope. Good morning. No. Oh, that's good. Okay, good. Please, two things. One, I tend to talk quickly when I get excited or when I'm nervous, of course. And so if I'm going too fast, I'd ask Joanne to sort of signal me, say, slow it down. But you also should feel free to, raise your hand and say, you're speaking too fast, you speak too quickly. Welcome. And I have notes that I'm going to use, so I'll try not to read them, but they're to help me remind me what I want to say. I really appreciate your being here. I hope you enjoy this. I'm going to give you a little bit of a forecast of what I'll do each time. There are 4 of these sessions. This first session I'm going to talk about, give a sort of focused history of disability in the United States mainly, and I'll explain why, but I'm also going to talk about race, because that's a part of because disability, race, and also social class intersect. The next session I'll talk about 3 main theories of disability. Where does disability come from? What is disability? Those kinds of questions. And I'll talk about how those 3 theories impact people differently. And the third session will review the various precedent-setting cases for the Individual with Disabilities Education Act. It originally was called the Education for All Handicapped Children. That was passed in 1972, but it's later been, in later iterations, it's called the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. The last day I will focus on various strategies used in the classroom to try to meet the learning needs of all children. I'll focus on something called universal design. It actually comes from architecture, but it's I'm looking at Lynn Kavanaugh, she's going, I know all this. Anyway, it's an assumption that if we make our practices accessible to people with or labeled with disabilities, we really improve education for everybody. And then I'm also going to end the last session with a short film. It's an award-winning documentary made in the 90s. It chronicles the story of a little boy, Peter, who has Down syndrome. And prior to the beginning of the film, he had been in actually a different school for people at the time would have been called mentally retarded. And he was included into, quote unquote, a normal 3rd grade classroom. And the film chronicles that first year for Peter. It's a really touching, meaningful film. I show it to my students and they cry. And I cry too, even though I've seen it many times. Oh, my breathing, that's lovely. I'll try not to breathe. Okay. I don't think anyone can present information completely neutrally. That's my own position. I'm not alone in that position, but there are people who disagree with that idea. So any speaker decides what to include, what to leave out, right? And my experiences and my perspectives influence what I leave in and what I take out. So I think it's important to let you know what my stance is in all the things that I'm discussing in these next 4 sessions. First of all, I believe we are all temporarily abled. And that's a really important concept. I think when I introduced this class 2 weeks ago, I said, if we're lucky, we'll all be disabled. Maybe saying we're all temporarily abled is a better way of putting it, but we're all, if we're lucky, going to get old. And many of us already are. And when we are old, things happen to the body. Sometimes our sight dims, sometimes our hearing fails, sometimes we have trouble getting around. I know my husband keeps saying that his brain is turning to mush. Mine so far hasn't, but you know, things happen. And that is the human condition. So to say that we're all temporarily able reminds us that this is not a condition that we don't all experience. It's a human thing. Second, there's no fixed definition of disability. Too many P's? Is that better?
No.
Little farther.
Better? Okay, is that better? Okay, okay. So beliefs about what's abnormal and normal have changed over history. And I always like to talk about, with my students, glasses, eyeglasses. Yeah, they're a fashion statement. You know, people wear them with, you know, all sorts of glitter on them and different colors, and I think mine are purple. And used to be, before eyeglasses were well made, that would prevent you from having a job. That would prevent you from doing a lot of things. I think it still prevents you from being a pilot. But, you know, the idea that now we just see eyeglasses, we don't say, oh, that person is disabled. You know, we think, oh, they're wearing glasses. But that didn't used to be the case. So I think what is normal or abnormal, what's abled and disabled has changed through history. And it differs across different cultures. I'm not going to go into that. I really am not an expert on that. But I do know that certain cultures have different attitudes about people that have been labeled with disabilities than especially Western culture. And I know we all agree with this. People with disabilities have the right to be respected and listened to. And there's a famous statement from the disability rights group. Nothing about us without us. In other words, don't be talking about people with disabilities. Don't be objectifying them. Listen to our voices. And so that's somewhat what I'm doing with that last film I'm showing you. And finally, progress is still needed. We're not there yet. We aren't a country where all people have full human rights. And I believe that people with disabilities are, that the rights of people with disabilities have and continue to be infringed upon, I guess would be the right way of putting it. This is an example. I told Joanne I kind of do this tangent thing, but last week I went to jury duty. And it was at the courthouse in Montezuma. Some of you may have been there for jury duty. And they have a little section where I guess the audience can sit, people who want to observe the trial. And the chairs are fairly close together. They're sort of like in almost like a bench. They're very close together. The aisles are very close together. And there were probably 60 of us there waiting for the voir dire. And while we were waiting, a woman got up and talked to us. She explained why we were there, what our duties would be. And then they showed a short film that explained, and the Supreme Court Justice of Iowa talked to us and explained why this was such an important act to be on a jury, but that it was the cornerstone of our legal system, that people have the right to be judged by a jury of their peers. What if the person who is on trial, uses a wheelchair? There was no one in the jury who used a wheelchair. You couldn't have got in that area if you used a wheelchair. No one in the jury was blind. Nobody in the jury was deaf. They might have been people who had hearing aids. But it occurred to me, and I'd never thought of this before, wow, you know, that's not a jury of your peers. If you have to be able-bodied to sit down in the courthouse in that section, then you're not allowing a person who's on trial to have a jury of his peers. So that's just a small example, but it's just, I think progress still needs to be made, and I think we forget. Because, like, for example, in that situation, it didn't occur to me until, because I was teaching this class, that I thought of it. I think I wouldn't have noticed it at all. Okay, so the next thing I want you to do is to do some thinking. Oh, wait, no, I'm going to do this first. I'm going to tell you the goals for my course. This is important. This is what I'm hoping that you'll get out of the course. I want you to gain some historical context on disability through our discussion of how disability has been constructed and defined through about maybe a couple, 3 centuries. And how it's affected those people that were considered to be disabled. And I want you to think about how we just decide a set of human traits is a disability. How does that happen? It's not natural. People have to make decisions. That particular set of traits is a disability. That particular set of traits is not. And this is according to, I'm going to talk about 3 main theories. And I'm hoping that's what you'll think about or come to analyze. I want you to learn about the legal history of disability rights, especially in school. I want you to think about to learn about how K-12 schools are evolving in their push for including all children. And then I want you to develop your own thinking about what it means to be abnormal. This slash there is a way of saying both ab and normal, and what it means to be human. So those are my goals for you. I hope one of the things that I tell my students, as an education professor, I think about, what is learning? What does it mean to say I've learned something? And I like to say, learning is changing your mind. Now that doesn't mean that you thought one thing when you came in and you think something completely different when you leave. But your perspective has been changed. Maybe a belief or an idea has been solidified. Maybe you are confused. I love it when people get confused because that means something is happening. Your brain is changing, your mind is changing. So I hope that learning happens, but that doesn't mean that I expect you all to agree with me or to think everything I say is wonderful. I just hope that it's thought-provoking, and if you leave with questions, that's great. That's perfect. Okay, so now I do want you to do some thinking. I want you to take a minute. I've given you this, I should have mentioned this before, the handout on your desk. It's just for you. You don't have to do anything with it. I'm not expecting you to take notes. The idea of universal design, one of the basic principles is whenever you teach anything, you should use at least 2 media. So I'm speaking, and I'm showing you up here, but I'm also giving you the slides on your desk. So if you want to take notes, or if you have a question, for example, you can jot it down. I'm not going to interrupt with questions, but at the end of the first session, if you have questions, you can come up and ask me, and I'll try to answer them when we start again. And then at the end of the session, if you have questions, you can either write them down or tell me, and then I'll try to answer them at our next session. The other thing is, as I said, I speak quickly. That's another thing I shouldn't do. So please, if I'm speaking too quickly or you can't understand me, raise your hand and signal, and Joanne's going to help me with that too. So I want you to think about defining disability, and you're welcome to just sit and think. You're welcome to jot down some ideas, or you're welcome to talk to somebody next to you. Okay, how do you define disability? I'll give you just a few minutes to think about that.
Physical and mental?
Both. He said physical and mental, and I said both. Just thinking about it, just, in your own head, or turn to somebody and say, this is what I think it is. Is that enough time? Y'all have an idea? Well, the American Community Survey, which is gathered from the Census Bureau, defines disability this way. They have 5 questions that they ask a person, and if the person answers any one of those questions as yes, that person is considered disabled. First, is this person deaf, or does he or she have serious difficulty hearing? So I think it's interesting. It doesn't say anything about hearing aids, right? But look at this next one. Is this person blind, or does he or she have serious difficulty seeing even when wearing glasses? Why doesn't it say he has difficulty hearing when wearing hearing aids? It should, except that my husband says they don't work. So, but I think it's what I was talking about. Somehow we've come to accept glasses as just a normal thing that people wear, but we still notice hearing aids. People are always trying to hide them. I was laughing with my students. What if you think in 20 years people are going to have hearing aids and they're going to have jewels on them and they're going to have things hanging from them, and it's going to be, you're going to rock your hearing aids, it's going to be really cool. Honestly, I think that's entirely possible. Yeah, so because of a physical, mental, or emotional condition, does this person have difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions? So this is where the mental comes in. I think this includes mental illness, but it also includes mental impairments. And then, does this person have serious difficulty walking or climbing stairs? And I think this is changing too, because they call this ambulatory. And it's a sad reason, but because of all the IVs and all the injuries that soldiers have experienced in the Iraq War and wars since then, we are getting so much better at making it possible for people to be ambulatory. And it wouldn't surprise me if in 20 or 25 years, ambulatoriness is not as big an issue as it is now, because there will be, you'll have stimulation in your brain that makes it possible for you to stand, or you have all sorts of, I guess you could say, aids that help make it possible for you to walk or to move, and these aids won't be considered a wheelchair. They'll just be considered like glasses, right? Just something we use to get around. And does this person have difficulty dressing or bathing? And that's all about independent living. This doesn't mean, do you have trouble choosing what outfit you're going to wear? That's different. When my daughter was in middle school, she would have definitely been disabled. All right. So, the other question that I thought, do you believe that people who are perceived to have disabilities have the quality of life that non-disabled people do in the U.S., and why or why not? So take a minute to think about this, but I'm going to talk about language here. I'll be talking about language a lot. Now, that's my thing. I was an English teacher for 12 years, and my area of education is English education. Language matters a lot. And I'll talk about that all 4 times. And I know we have changed names for different kinds of disabilities over the years, and I don't know whether changing the names has helped or not. But instead of calling it the abbreviation that I see in all the things that I read are people with disabilities, PWD, and I've decided to change it for this talk to people perceived to have disabilities. And I'll explain more about that later, but I know it's kind of awkward, PPHD, but I want it to be, I want to be upfront about the fact that this is, at least in my opinion, partly our perception of others rather than something that's inside that person. So think about this. What about quality of life? What do you think makes quality of life? How do you say I have a good quality of life? Think about it for a minute. Maybe talk to somebody next to you. Write something down if you like. I'll give you a few minutes. I just sort of arbitrarily chose some things that I think matter, but you may have completely different ideas, but I thought some statistics might be interesting to you. By the way, on the handout, I have links to all these statistics, but they're so tiny, you probably need a magnifying glass to read them. So if you, after the whole session is over, if any of you want me to email you those links, or somehow we could get you the links in larger print, so if you actually want to look at them, you can. First of all, in 2015, and this came from the census, 20.8% of people perceived to have disabilities had less than a high school education. And that's compared to only 12% of the non-disabled. I think having a high school education leads to all sorts of positive things in a person's life, and not having it can lead to, I guess, a denigration of quality of life. Secondly, regardless of the education level, doesn't matter. People with disabilities, people perceived to have disabilities, are less likely to be employed. In 2015, the people with disabilities, people perceived to have disabilities, unemployment rate was 11.7%, more than twice what non-disabled people's are. The poverty rate, of course these are all connected, right? But the poverty rate for people perceived to have disabilities is 28.1%. That's not children. That's 16 to 64-year-olds. And in 16 to 64-year-olds in the United States, for the whole population, it's, without being disabled, it's 12%. And finally, in 2012, at least 40% of incarcerated persons had some disability or were perceived to have some disability. So I think the answer is no. People who are perceived to have disabilities do not have the quality of life as a non-disabled person, beyond the challenge of the disability. I think that's the important thing to know. It isn't about having the disability. It's about these kinds of things that make the quality of life less positive. I know you probably thought of other ways of other things about quality of life, and those are just sort of statistics that I thought might bring home the idea that, yes.
That, the third one, the U.S. overall 12%, does that U.S. overall, is that inclusive of the PPHD people, or?
No, no, just, I'm sorry, I should have said non-disabled, yes. I'm comparing them, yeah. Okay, finally, did you attend school, K-12 school, with someone who was perceived to have a disability? If so, what was your interaction with that person? And to what extent was that person included in class activities? Looking at most of you, the answer is probably no. Good, good. That's good to know. Yeah. I had, when I was in kindergarten, there was a little girl, I don't know her name, first name is Janie, and Janie had Down syndrome, and she came to my kindergarten class. And I remember one day we were going on a field trip, and she was supposed to have worn slacks or pants, and she had on a dress. And so I walked Janie home to get her to change her clothes. And I remember feeling like I was just so wonderful for doing that, what a nice person I am. Janie did not come to school after kindergarten. Okay, in 1970, only 1 in 5 people perceived to have a disability were in regular schools. 1 in 5. Now it's 96%.
Is this still 16 to 64?
No, this is school age. So this would be kindergarten through school age. Yeah. Actually, maybe all the way up to 21, because the law allows people up to 21 to be in school. In 2016, 60% of people perceived to have disabilities were included at least 80% of the day. And this is because of the law. And I'll be talking a lot more about that. And that really changed after 1994 with the iteration of the IDA law, because it emphasized this idea called least restrictive environment, which meant that the child had to be in the least restrictive environment possible during the day. And, those with intellectual disabilities, cognitive disabilities, were in self-contained classrooms nearly 50% of the time, in 2016. So there's still a population of people perceived to have disabilities who are not experiencing school in a regular classroom most of the time. And I think that's a problem, but we can talk more about that. Okay. So there are sort of laid my cards on the table. Now we'll start the actual information that I'm going to provide you. It hasn't been a particularly happy picture, our treatment of people perceived to have disabilities in this country and in Europe. And as I said, I really don't know anything about non-Western cultures to tell you, but I know that some American Indian tribes have very different ideas about people with disabilities, especially people who were, who we might consider schizophrenic or, insane. But that differs from one tribe to another, so there really isn't any way to generalize that. But in the United States, in Western history, I see our treatment of people with disabilities or people perceived to have disabilities as with three parallel behaviors. They didn't necessarily occur in chronological order, although I think abuse, I hope, has much faded. So abuse is one way, and often we treat people because we're afraid of them or because we feel shame. And we mistreat people that make us feel shame or make us afraid. And oftentimes, and this is especially during medieval times, it was connected to this idea of a curse or the mark of the devil, something like that. Avoidance, later on and parallel, another thing that happened with people who were perceived to have disabilities is that they were kept away from the normal population, quote unquote normal population, because they were considered dangerous for all sorts of reasons, which I'll explain. And patronization, basically thinking that someone, because they have a disability, is inferior to us and needs our help, and often is disrespected. So not all cultures, like I said, have abused people with perceived to have disabilities, but in the Western culture, in the medieval period especially, it was believed if a child was born, say, with a hair lip or a club foot or some sort of deformity, that could have been as a result of the mother's sin. Or it could have been, something that you would be ashamed of. The child was somehow dangerous. So infanticide happened, incarceration, and basically people would be locked up in a room or tied down or kept away somehow from other people. And there were exorcisms because it was considered to be, there was a devil inside you. And exorcism in some cases is pretty much like torture. And when the Renaissance came, now this is a lot of this was connected to religion. And when the Renaissance came, or during the time of the Renaissance, more humane practices were coming. People believed or were thinking differently about religion and thinking differently about human problems. But that didn't really stop the abuse in many settings. And then finally, in our country, in the early history of the U.S., abuse was fairly common. There are records kept of infanticide, allowing a child to die of exposure if the child had some sort of deformity. Also, the Puritans wouldn't let anybody who was perceived to have a disability come. They weren't allowed to immigrate to the United States. So, trying to keep the population healthy, I think, quote unquote. Up to the mid-1990s, 1900s, people perceived to have disabilities have been abused. There are all sorts of examples. If you saw one flew over the cuckoo's nest, you know what I'm talking about. People were lobotomized, they were shocked, but this is not like electroconvulsive shock now. It was actually very, very brutal. Shackled, straitjacketed, drugged into submission, and forcibly sterilized. Avoidance happened a lot more in the 19th and 20th centuries in the U.S., and the governments, or the state governments or territories, created almshouses for the poor and colony houses for the feeble-minded, the epileptic, all sorts of, there's a long list of things that warranted institutionalization. That's because people believed that disabilities like epilepsy, tuberculosis, intellectual disabilities, and personality traits, for example, well, I'll talk about that later, were heritable. In other words, you inherited them. So we want to keep that population separate from the quote-unquote normal population, right? Because we don't want any inbreeding. We don't want people to have children with people that are abnormal, because then their children will be abnormal. And also, there was just fear. Like I said, there was fear. People were made uncomfortable And you know, I think we've all had this experience. Whenever I go to a big city and I see somebody who's homeless but also maybe having trouble separating reality from non-reality, I get uncomfortable. I mean, I forgive myself for that. But this was really, oftentimes these colony houses were way out of the urban center or the city, and they were self-sustaining. They had gardens, they made their own clothing. Basically, the idea was keep this group separate so that we never have to have any interaction with them. So completely out of sight, out of mind. I have another little tangent here that I was thinking about when I was preparing this. When I was in high school, I lived in a town in western Kansas, and we had a sanatorium, is that what it's called? Where there were tuberculosis patients long ago at the turn of the 20th century. And that tuberculosis got cured, or people left, didn't have to be in that institution anymore. We called it the sanatorium, or the SAN. And so to use the building, it became an institution for people that were mentally retarded, was what would be the word at the time. And some of the people were adults with Down syndrome, some of them had traumatic brain injury, some of them had cerebral palsy. I mean, there were a number of different sorts of problems that these people had. And it was encouraged for people in high school to do service. And so I would go out to the SAN and have music classes for these people. Not that I had any training in music whatsoever, but I could sing and I could play the piano. And so I would go twice a month or something, and I meet with these people, and there would be a group of probably 30 or 40. They separated the men and the women, so I would either have all men or all women. And it never occurred to me that there was anything odd about that. Why weren't these people in our community? Why were they all, they were ambulatory, they could get to music class. I think many of them could dress themselves. They weren't blind, they weren't deaf. Some of them did have some problems seeing, but I'm saying that there was this a total acceptance on my part. Of course these people should be separate. Of course they shouldn't have anything to do with the town that I live in. And I was so beneficent and wonderful to go out and sing with them. I mean, I think this is just a really good example of the kind of patronization that people with disabilities experience. And I asked a staff worker there, especially the men, but the women too, would come into the music class, and I would be all happy, and we would be singing, and half of the people would fall asleep. And I said, I thought maybe that was a brain injury thing or something. He says, oh no, he says, we give them drugs to calm them down. And to bother me, seems fine to me. So I think this is, our minds get used to these kinds of things. And this isolation is still going on, but it's not nearly as prevalent, especially after lots of institutions were closed. Post-Civil War, it improved for some. This is really interesting. There's a story about a man who was in the Civil War, and he had a leg amputation, and when he returned home, he received a pension from the government, which really saved him and his family from destitution. But if people had any kind of mental problems, if they, I don't even know if they called it in shell shock after the Civil War, but if they had some sort of, I think it would be PTSD now, they weren't given a pension because they were assumed to be cowardly or weak or, and I guess that hasn't changed. I said I wasn't going to get into politics, but okay. Right. And then finally, patronization. There was improvement in the 1900s because Braille was invented and sign language became common. And I know if you've heard of Gallaudet, there were a lot of institutions like Gallaudet where people could go and get training in order to, and they didn't stay in the institution, they just were institutionalized while they were getting the training, and then they could come and have some sort of work outside the institution. For me, I remember it was always piano tuning for people who were blind. Right? That's, so they would get some sort of training so that they could have a job when they left the institution. But many people were still institutionalized. And I think partly because up until 1970, there was nowhere for them to go. They weren't allowed to go to school, or they weren't encouraged to go to school. And there was just, it was a burden on the family, and the institution seemed like a logical place. And most of the institutions, as far as I know, were probably lovely, but they were still institutions, and you were still not with your families. And people perceived to have disabilities are, they're always perceived as needing help and charity. Like I said, I was so nice to go out and sing with these people. And they're inferior, and they really may be dangerous to the genetic pool. But I don't know if anybody knows about the deaf culture idea. This is really fascinating to me, and it really boggles, we really wrestle with this in my class. Deaf culture is a group of people, let's see if I can make this work. Oops, no, that didn't make it work, did it? Oh, there, okay. They have 10 commandments. I thought this was really interesting. So, you should not put hearing culture above deaf culture. So, a person in deaf culture believes that they are not disabled. That's mind-boggling, right? They're deaf and they're not disabled. You shall not lose eye contact when communicating with a deaf person. And notice they capitalize the D. You shall not communicate in sign language. I mean, you shall communicate in sign language. You shall not be, I think this is a typo, you shall not be the deaf person's sign language teacher, instructor. You shall not be a deaf person's English grammar teacher. You shall not be a deaf person's speech therapist. You shall not be the deaf person's comedian, telling non-deaf, apparently there are non-deaf jokes and puns. You shall not be the deaf person's mother. You shall view deaf people as an ethnic group, not as handicapped people. And you shall believe deaf people can do all things. So this is I think it's let's see if I can get out of here, it's going to be tricky. I think this is a really interesting idea that a group of people, non-hearing deaf people, say, we're not handicapped, we are a culture. The way we live our lives, the language we use, the practices that we engage in make us a culture. And so, we're a culture. But this group of people, the deaf culture, also refuse to have cochlear implants that might bring hearing, and they're adamant that this is not a handicap. To be deaf is not a handicap. Right. Oops, I went backwards, didn't I? Oops, I went way backwards. Sorry. Oh, okay. Oh boy, all right. Going way back, before the Enlightenment, which is basically 1700s, and a growing faith in science and rationality, which is basically what the Enlightenment was, the Christian world had this concept called the Great Chain of Being. And why am I talking about this? Why does it have anything to do with disability? Well, it turns out that, this is my theory, you can debunk it if you like, but it turns out that people at the time, and this was an ancient idea really, believed that there was a hierarchy of life. And at the bottom of the hierarchy would have been actually stones and things like that that had absolutely no spirit, what we would say no spirit. And then you move up plants, animals, people, and then the angels and archangels and God. The Great Chain of Being posited that as you got farther up the chain and got closer to God, you had more potential for salvation, more potential because you had more spirit in you. Even the vegetables were hierarchized. Oh wow, good. The vegetables were hierarchized. The people were hierarchized. And how they were hierarchized was, I'm going to show you this. It's a really pretty bad image, but it'll maybe give you the idea. I'm sorry, I couldn't find a better one. Okay, so there's God, and there are the archangels and the angels, and in the middle here would be a king, the divine right of kings. The king is closest to the angels because he has the most spirit. And then out here would have been, I don't know, dukes and lords. And down here are the peasants. And out the people farthest out on this chain are the farthest from God. So like you can see they have trees and animals and, right. And this may seem kind of ridiculous, but it was really very well accepted way of seeing the world. And it was what gave kings the right to, right, yeah, their divine rights. Okay, I think I have to stop. Do I have to stop? Or you want me to go one? I can go one more minute. Okay. So what I'm trying to say here is that I think, and like I said, this may be a leap, but the assumptions of the superiority of some people over others as being natural, as being the way the world is ordered, I think it bled into the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment, that was a time when people were really arguing with the idea of the divine right of kings. Of course, it was when the American Revolution happened and other revolutions, this idea that a peasant was inferior to a king was thrown out, at least by some cultures. But I think what got replaced, or what never really got lost, was this idea that some people are inferior to other people. And in this case, it was the superiority of whites that sort of bled into the Enlightenment. And Thomas Jefferson, wonderful guy, not trying to cast aspersions on Thomas Jefferson. He was a man of his time, and he really struggled with this idea about one, and we'll talk about race in a minute, but one race being superior to another. But he said he had his suspicions that blacks are inferior in body and mind, and that allowed us to enslave people without as much guilt. Because if that was really all they were capable of doing was working in the fields and that kind of thing, then it was probably okay to use them that way. All right? I guess we're breaking.
Now we'll go on with the second half of the first class on disability and being human.
And I can't get this on. What does that mean? Okay. All right, so I use Jefferson as an example. Is that better? No? Okay. I use Jefferson as an example because we venerate him, rightly so. He was expressing an idea that was everywhere. And I want to say something before I start talking more about race. Race doesn't exist. We're all the same race. There's no black race, Asian race. It took them a while, but the American Association of Anthropology finally came out with a statement to that effect. It's really important. It's kind of a interesting thing to know that there are more genetic differences between two people sitting here than there are between so-called white race and so-called black race. So genetic diversity is everywhere, but you can't determine someone is African or African American or Asian by genetics because we are all the same race. So so when I see these things on television where somebody's saying, well, this is your ancestry, they're not doing it by racial genetics, they're doing it they're tracing where your family came from. We can't do that genetically. But just, there is no such thing as race. Now, that doesn't mean that, well, there is such a thing as race because we've constructed it and we make it work in the world. My experience of race, I think that really brought home how much of a construction it is when I went to South Africa with George. And I think, George, were there 11 different races or something like that?
Certainly, they use 11 different languages.
Yeah, and so you had identification according to your race. So there was the San people, there were blacks, there were colors, there were, and...
Those were 4 categories.
Yeah, and we went to a bar. We were out in the country at a little bar, and this woman that was leading the group, she was just wonderful. We went in and got a beer, and we were sitting out. I think we were playing cards or something. And the woman said to us, "What race do you think that woman is?" And I, going, well, she was white, right? She had light hair. She was light skinned. I think she even had freckles. She said, "Oh no." She said she's South African. And she knew because she had been living in South Africa. So there was something about the physical traits of that woman that she read. She was not being racist. She was just saying, this kind of difference is created in South African culture. So, this idea that race only exists because we construct it that way. And I'll talk more about that. But it's important to understand there is no such thing as a black race or an Asian race or a white race. So I'm going to show you this. This is from 1799, and this is where the great chain of being and this idea of hierarchy is illustrated with the races, quote unquote. Again, these are not real, but so you have here, you have a gorilla, here you have a Negro, here you have an American savage, and here you have an Asiatic. And the idea is that as they go this direction, they become more human or more superior. And down here you have the European, and then you have the Roman, and then you have the Greek. And of course the Greek antiquity, that was the height of human, I guess, civilization. So you see that we sort of adapted the great chain of being and made it about race rather than about societal position. So Thomas Jefferson and all the rational lovers of science during the Enlightenment said, well, we need to do science to prove that white Europeans, northern white Europeans, are superior to everybody else. So here comes Samuel Morton. Now he collected thousands of skulls, thousands from all over the world. And he had a theory that a different skull size marked more or less intelligence. So but he decided that just using some sort of a measuring device on the outside of the skull wasn't good enough, so he collected these skulls and he took the top off, the very top, and filled them with lead shot, or sometimes seeds. And then he weighed the lead shot, and the skulls that had the most lead shot had the most brain capacity, or the biggest brain, or the most intelligence. And this proved that women, who always have smaller heads than men, right, are not as intelligent. It was a good justification. Women should not, and I have a very small head, which is causing the mic problem. But apparently I've overcome my lack of intelligence. So anyway, Morton believed that there were different races of men. Polygenism is the word, that's the name for it. So he believed that there were several different races of men, and that different races of men had different intellectual capacities. He was critiqued in a book, Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould. Gould said, and this, I think, scientists among us would admit that, I guess I'm not a scientist, scientists among you would admit that sometimes science finds what it expects to find. Yeah, and so this conclusion, the conclusion that Morton reached, that northern white Europeans were superior to other races, confirmed his belief that he went in believing. But Gould says that he fudged, probably unconsciously, he fudged his data. He has a whole chapter in this book on how he fudged his data. Honestly, and there's some controversy, but honestly, I don't think it matters, because it's not the data that matters, it's the assumption that a larger skull means more intelligence. That has been completely debunked. That is just not true. Women, right? It's not true.
Was this during Samuel Morton?
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
During the 1800s?
It would have been, yes, late 1800s, right around the Civil War.
Okay.
How amazing, right? I'm sorry, I should have put a date up there. But I wanted to say a little bit. Stephen Jay Gould wrote this book quite a while ago, and then he did a new edition after a book called The Bell Curve came out. And I'm going to talk about the bell curve the next time we meet. But it's a book, a very troubling book, that sort of actually supports this idea that a particular race is inferior to another. Not exactly. We'll get into more detail about that. These two men, Knott and Agassiz, they were pro-slavery. That's, so it was pre-Civil War or during the Civil War, and they went around giving big lectures about Morton's research and saying, look, this proves that African Americans are not of the same race, they're less intelligent, they're more capable of doing physical labor, that's what they're naturally born to do, that's where they are on this great chain of being. I have a 1920 encyclopedia that describes the Negro as good with his hands and good at manual labor. So this is not an idea that has that was 1920. So another way that science, I say that with quotes, science was proving that there were certain traits that were inherited. And this is more about individual characteristics and gets into the idea of disability, but it also is about race. I'm going to show you this little image, disturbing image. Oh, there we go. This is from a book. I think it's, what is it? Vaught's Practical Character Reader. So, physiognomy looked at bumps on the head, and I know, it's pretty scary, isn't it? So, that is a deceitful eye. It's deep set, and it has a low brow. And that means if you see someone with deep set eyes and low brows, they're deceitful. Don't marry them. Don't let your daughter marry them. Here's a deceitful mouth. I think I have that one. And then there's a deceitful chin, and look at that, a deceitful head. Okay, I'm not done yet. All right, and then there's the deceitful nose. Remind you of anything? So, obviously, I mean, maybe not obviously, but I think a lot of us would call that a hooked nose, and we would associate that with the Jewish population, and they're deceitful. There's also a sincere and deceitful eye. I guess we already saw that. So I think it's really important. The last one, this is the shape of the head. If you have too broad of a head through here, that means that you're prone to violence. Prone to violence, which will be brutal. Okay, so all broad-headed humans are vicious. They're vicious. Yes. So there you go. So you want to marry somebody with a sort of narrow head. I don't know who this guy is. He looks kind of vicious to me. I don't know. So anyway, yeah. It sounds ridiculous, but this was considered science, and this was used to make judgments about people. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but there were people would measure the length of the arm compared to the length of the body, and that indicated something that actually considered that you were lower on the evolutionary chain if your arms were longer, because that made you more ape-like. Yeah, and I think I have a friend that played volleyball for the Olympics. She had really long arms. Also there's the position of your ears. If your ears are low on your head, that means you're promiscuous. Okay, so things like that. All right. I think it's at the St. Louis Fair. There was I don't know the 1904 fair. It's a really interesting. If you you can go look at this website because it has a virtual tour of the site. It was set up so that it sort of mimicked the order of civilization. So the highest form of civilization, there were this white building with columns, and it was the hall of art and industry. And then as it was laid out, more and more primitive societies were illustrated so that you could sort of see the progress of man. And this is an example. Some people, even at the time, objected and said it was like a human zoo because they had Native American tribes and people from other countries and other places in their, I should say, natural habitat and going about their daily lives. And you could come and take pictures and view it, as if they were, I guess, in a zoo, you might say. This is an example of a tribe from the Philippines from the fair. There they are in their natural habitat. And you could walk along, and take pictures. You could come up and see their house and see what they're cooking. They're all wearing their tribal dress, and they're using, these are the kinds of canoes they had, and so there are all along the walk of the World's Fair. There are these exhibits, which I think this is 1904. So it shows this acceptance of the idea that some people are naturally inferior. Some people are not as capable as others. Some people are more prone to, now this is by a culture or a race, they probably call this a race, but it was also by individual physiognomy. So, Now we get to eugenics. Eugenics is a theory that a human population can be improved by selective breeding. Any of you are farmers, you know that eugenics is that we do selective breeding with our animals, with pigs and cows and I suppose chickens. I don't know. Anyway, we know about it because of the Nazis, right? You know, that was a eugenics, the idea that you wanted to preserve the German race by eliminating Jews for one thing, but also other people. I don't know that it's well known, but the first ovens in Germany were for disabled people. Families would send their children to these institutions, and then they would get a letter saying that their child had died, but actually the child had been killed. But I guess we should admit that Americans are really the one who popularized eugenics, and this was right after the Civil War. So way before the Nazis used it to justify their mass killing. Some people think that one of the reasons eugenics became so popular after the Civil War and at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, was due to this huge influx of immigrants and former slaves moving north to cities to find work. There was terrible poverty, a lot of overcrowding. There weren't good social services. The schools were totally inundated. The churches didn't know what to do. I mean, it was a time when our cities were really, really reeling from this huge population coming, and the Irish had already gotten there. I don't know if maybe you know this if you have some Irish heritage. The Irish came in the early 1800s, maybe 30 or 40, I think. George might know. Anyway, they were considered basically equivalent to African Americans. The Irish, in fact, they were jailed with African Americans, and they were compared in their physiognomy to African Americans. See, here's an Irish guy, he looks just like an African American, only he's white. And so this idea that people who were not Northern European, although it's so weird because the Irish are Northern European, but they weren't, the right Northern European, they are inferior, and they're poor and they're uneducated and they don't speak English, and all these kinds of things that led to this idea, well, and one eugenicist said, in 2 generations we could solve this problem. We sterilize them all, and we don't let any more people from Southern Europe or Eastern Europe into the country. Solve the problem, right? I think I just heard Denmark say this. I do, I'm not kidding. I think this is what their new, yeah. So anyway, I said I wasn't going to get political. So these usual institutions were not working. So people migrated or thought, okay, maybe eugenics is the answer. It was also what I just said. So if you think someone, they have a hooked nose, or they have a broad face, or some sort of other characteristic, they might be more likely to be criminals, they might be more likely to be promiscuous, those kinds of things. So we want to breed those traits out, and we would create a better population if we could do that. Between 1907 and 1939, 30,000 people were forcibly sterilized in the United States. It's probably more than that, but I got that from this, the Jewish Virtual Library. It's a very interesting source if you want to do more research. Galton Society, this is a way that eugenics was popularized. They had a newspaper. Galton, Sir Francis Galton was an English guy, English lord, I think, if he was a sir. And he was a eugenicist. He was what they call a positive eugenicist, but I'm really not sure there's such a thing. But anyway, the society was named after him because he was respected and well known. They had a newspaper. They had conventions, national congresses, where people would speak about eugenics and what a good thing it was. There were sermon contests, and there were the Fitter Family contests, which I think are just fascinating. I don't know, I couldn't find one in Iowa, but they were definitely in Kansas, Massachusetts, Georgia. They probably were in Iowa as well. So this site, the first thing I want to show you is this pretty horrifying slide. I don't know how well you can see it, but, oops, I want it to be bigger. Stay bigger. Okay, well, I guess that's as big as it gets. Here it says, some people are born to be a burden on the rest. And learn about heredity so you can help to correct these conditions. So here it says, every 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes for the care of persons with bad heritage, bad genes, bad something, such as insanity, feeble-mindedness, criminals, and other defects, I think it says. Down here, these are lights and they go off. So this is, see, it's wired. And so this light would go off every 15 seconds to say, oh, $100 has been spent to care for somebody. Here, every 48 seconds, a person is born who will never get beyond the age of 8 mentally. Here, every 50 seconds, somebody's put in jail. And look at this. Very few normal persons go to jail. And this light flashes every 15 seconds. That's when somebody's born. But how often is somebody of superior intelligence born? Only every 7 minutes. So this was at all of these. I mean, everything I'm looking at, I see this board everywhere. Another interesting thing is, let's see if I can get out of here. Okay. All right, I'm going to go back. There are just some other interesting things. I'll try to navigate it better this time. I think this is fascinating. Maybe it's not so fascinating for you. So they would have like lectures where a lot of people would come and listen. There they are listening to the eugenics lecture. But the other thing that they could do is they could go be tested to see if they were a fitter family. So look at this. There they are, measuring their head, looking at their, I guess they undress the children. I don't know if they undress the adults. But they did all these measurements. They weighed them. They measured the length of their arm compared to the length of their body. They measured their head circumference. Right here, that's probably what she's doing. I'm sure they looked at their teeth and, all the kinds of, looked at their nose, where's the ear placement, that kind of thing. But you can see how scientific it is. It's all, they're wearing white coats and it's, they're on white tables. And here's the parents standing by looking at them being measured. And then if you became a fitter family, you got to wear a medal. Yay, I have a goodly heritage. And you could wear the medal and you could walk around the fair wearing this medal because you had a goodly heritage. Here's a family. This is a family, a small family. They have goodly heritage. Let's see if I can find another one. Here's another larger family that has goodly heritage. I read somewhere that they actually had a little, kind of like a card that had various degrees of whiteness. So if you weren't above a certain level of whiteness, you were not of a goodly heritage if your skin was a little too dark. Yeah. So, yes. And, okay, you think this is ridiculous. I mean, it does seem kind of ridiculous. But courses on eugenics were offered at Harvard, Columbia, very, very elite institutions. And high school textbooks in their biology and history sections had, they promoted eugenics. They talked about...
When was this?
This would have been between probably the latter part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. Clear up till 1920. I know. In fact, this is interesting. When I was in college, I had a biology professor who talked about how we should be careful about who we marry. He said, look, what's the family history? What kind of illnesses do they have? How healthy are they? So in a way, that was eugenics. I mean, he wasn't promoting eugenics, but this idea that you need to, keep the family stock healthy, that's what I guess you would call positive eugenics. Then this is a very famous court case. I was talking about the sterilizations earlier. This is a famous court case in Virginia. They passed a law that said sterilization should be legal. There was a colony, the Virginia Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded People. And that was where Emma Buck was placed. Now, I read a lot about this. It's a very complicated story. But apparently, Emma Buck was married, or at least she had a wedding ring, when she was institutionalized for promiscuity because she was pregnant. Now, I don't know how somebody got institutionalized. Maybe her husband was able to do it. I don't know. Or maybe she didn't have a husband and she was just wearing a wedding ring. I don't know. But anyway, she was committed for promiscuity because she had a child outside of wedlock. That happened. So then she had Carrie, her child Carrie, and Carrie was sent to a foster home where she was raped by some relative of the foster parents and got pregnant herself. Her daughter Vivian was put out in a foster home after Carrie had it, and she was cursorily examined and found to be backward and likely to be promiscuous. I'll show you a picture of them. No, this Vivian isn't in the picture. Now, I want you to notice something. Look at those deep-set eyes. Look at those heavy eyebrows. I don't know, is that a deceitful mouth? Her ears are kind of low in her head. I mean, this is what people said. And so they were forcibly sterilized because it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it's a very famous case because this is when Oliver Wendell Holmes said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And they sterilized them.
And Vivian was examined at age 7
Months and found to be backward.
And like,
Okay, so now I'm going to get a little controversial perhaps, but I'm saying that intelligence tests aren't a lot different than lead shot. Through the 1800s, scientists wanted to continue to prove in more scientific ways that intelligence was inherited, that it was a fixed trait, and that you could tell how intelligent someone would be by their racial background. So we stopped craniometry, which is measuring the head either with lead shot or with some sort of measuring device. And this is the sort of the birth of modern psychology. Was the invention of the creation of the intelligence test is what sort of put psychology on the map in terms of American history. I want to tell you a little bit about Alfred Binet. Poor Alfred Binet. He developed a test that he wanted to use to determine if a child coming into school would need a little more help. So he created this test. It was an individual test that you gave to an individual child, much like if you've ever seen a WISC, which is a child IQ test. They had to put blocks together in a certain pattern. They had to categorize things, like tools that are alike with other tools. They had to sort other things. They had to do some simple mathematics, like if you have 2 apples and I give you 2 more, how many do you have, those kinds of things. And what Binet did was he said, okay, this child is 5, and most children who are 5 can do these tasks. So I'm going to give the child a physical age and a mental age. And the difference between that mental age and that physical age was how you got the IQ score. But Binet never meant it to be used as an intelligence test. It was simply a tool to help French schools figure out which kids are going to need some help. That was all he wanted it to be used for. But that's not what happened. This was right before the First World War, and the army, the military, wanted some way of sorting inductees. They wanted to know, well, who's going to be a good soldier, who could be an officer, who is somebody that I need to, who's just going to be an infantryman, something like that. And so that's what the IQ test became. The first version of the IQ test was, I'm going to show you this, I don't know whether you really want to see it, but I think it's interesting. This is a bell curve. That's part of the way the IQ test works is it's the assumption that human intelligence is distributed along a normal curve. I'm not going to do a lot of theory, but basically human height is distributed. I mean, if you take a big sample of humans, they're going to be short people like me, they're going to be tall people, and most people are going to be right in here. Most people's height is going to be in here. The same is true of weight, but only babies, because other things intervene, right, with weight. So the idea is that most people are going to be in this range from 85 to 115 would be of normal intelligence or average intelligence. Of course, 100 is average. And then there are going to be people who are way out here, people who are very, 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 very smart, and people who are quite impaired. So this assumption that intelligence is going to be along a normal curve it's important because it allows, and IQ tests were normed so that they would, so that the most frequent score would be a score of 100. These tests were designed to determine, like I said, what sort of inductees could play in the military. Could play? I don't know. What they could play, the role they could play. They weren't playing in the military, as far as I know. I want to show you a little short version of the test. I don't know. I didn't know any of these answers. Bull Durham is the name of a, is that tobacco? Okay. 7-Up? Is that a card game? No idea.
Yes.
I like this. The most prominent industry of Minneapolis. Does anybody have any idea? How about this? Who is George Ade? Or Audi? Soap. Who made soap? Laura Jean Libby is known as, and I don't know what she did, but these are really interesting. The moral ones were interesting. If a grocer should give you too much money by making change, what is the right thing to do? You don't give it to the poor, I don't think. I think you tell him you made a mistake. I don't know, though. I like this one, too. Why should food be chewed before swallowing? I don't know. But here's my favorite. I'm a vegetarian, so this is funny. Why is beef better than cabbage? Because I think most people would say all three, right? I know. Okay, so the point being, this exam that they used to test people is so based on American culture. And of course, many of the people that are being inducted into the Army are immigrants who haven't been in the United States that long. In fact, many of them didn't speak English. There were two forms of the test. One was written like that, and one was oral, for those who could not read. The test was given in English, regardless of whether the person spoke English. And only 12% scored with above average intelligence. Over 40% were being morons. I wonder why. I don't know. The scariest thing is that this test, this alpha test and beta test were used to screen immigrants from about 1922 on, for a long time. I don't know when the test got changed. But people would still say that the IQ test has a cultural bias. That some people would say that. And then eventually, as I'm going to talk about more tomorrow, these were a key tool for selecting and sorting people in school. So IQ tests have been a very powerful tool for deciding what level of education a child would have. How am I doing? One more? Okay. So there's something, this is, I don't know if any of you know about the Taylor method. Okay, so what happened was the country was becoming more and more industrialized. This is, 1920s, 30s, and as I said, the cities were very, very overcrowded. There was a lot of child labor. There was a big move to industrialize and to make industry to make manufacturing more efficient, and the efficient meant, in factories, it meant, well, you just do one job. You're the guy who puts the thing in the widget, and you do that all day long. And somebody else does something else. And you got decided to put the thing in the widget, or the widget in the thing, or whatever, because of partly maybe because of your quote-unquote race, but also just because it made it more efficient for one person to do something rather than have a less organized way of producing something. Also, another part of that efficiency movement was to give incentives for production. So in factories, there would be people who walked around the floor, and they all had white coats on, and they'd walk around the floor and they'd look at how you were doing, and they'd have a little stopwatch. How long does it take you to put that widget in the thing, you know? And they would stopwatch, and then they would say, I think you could do it in 10 seconds instead of 11. And if you do it in 10 seconds, then I'll give you, I don't know, a raise or some sort of incentive. So there was all sorts of sort of, I guess you could say, there were people on the factory floor trying to make things move smoothly and more quickly and more efficiently. Well, it worked really well in factories, so why wouldn't it work in schools? So this is, in the efficiency movement, this is really 20s, 30s, 40s, when the efficiency movement was, it's called the progressive movement, but it's administrative progressive, and it's not John Dewey. Although John Dewey wasn't totally opposed to some of this. So what happened was in schools, they did one smart thing. Before that, everybody was doing everything all at the same time, but then they started saying, okay, you guys, you're in the biology lab now, you're going to be in music class, you're going to be in phys ed, you're going to be in the home ec room, you know. So they started using all the rooms of the school instead of the building, instead of just having students move from room to room. And they also had more scientific ways of assessing how children were doing. They had things like time on task measures. And you know, the scary thing is that really hasn't gone away. But so there would be people standing there and they would be timing with a little thing, how long does this child stay on the task, you know, that kind of thing. They also had all sorts of interesting expectations for teachers, but I'm not going to talk about that. So so what happened was, about the latter part of the 1800s, a group of college presidents got together. And they decided, they were called the Committee of 10, so I guess there were 10 of them. And they decided that this is the time when the high school was sort of coming into its own. Before that, people didn't go to high school, right? And really not even in the 1920s, a lot of people didn't go. But there was this idea of the high school instead of the academy. The academy was usually private, it was for people going to college. But there were going to be a public school that would go all the way, what we now know as high school. Well, what should be the curriculum? So this Committee of 10 got together and said, it should be a liberal arts curriculum. Everybody should learn the same thing. They should learn to be critical thinkers. They should learn to be good citizens. They should have all this, they should read Greek, and they should, you know, study calculus, all this kind of thing. Well, that did not fly. The cardinal principles came out of a meeting in reaction to the Committee of 10, and they said, let me tell you what they said. They said, this is not going to work with the current population of the school because we don't have, the people aren't as smart as they used to be. Because, you know, we're not all white anymore. We're not all Northern European. This is what they said. Because these students were perceived to lack ability, intellectual ability, or the means to go to college, it was counterproductive to demand that they follow a college prep program. That would be a waste of time. Such a hardcore regimen would force them to drop out, which is what we don't want. So the commission, this cardinal principles came out of this commission, said, let's have tracks. Let's have lower tracks for those people that have less intellectual ability, and let's have higher tracks for people that are going to go on to college. And how are we going to determine who should be in the track? What are we going to use? The IQ test. It's great. We have one, and we'll use it. And it will tell us just what we expect. All the people in the lower tracks are going to be Poles, they're going to be Italians, they're going to be Irish, they're going to be freed African slaves. All the people in the upper tracks are going to be Northern Europeans, just the way it should be. And so that's really how, well, we'll talk more about this. That's really not changed so much in American schools. And they also used measurements of like interest. To, you know, do you want to be a mechanic? They'd ask a child, do you want to be a mechanic, or do you want to be a farmer? You know, that kind of thing. Okay, I think I'm done. Done? Okay.
Thank you. This has been Jean Ketter, Professor of Education at Grinnell College. She will be back again next week to continue her course on disabilities and being human. Thank you very much, Jean. See you all next week.